Jody offered me the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, so this is a little bit different than kind of introducing an in-house guy like Kendall. The next speaker is our 2021 recipient of the Private Sector Impact Award. A little background on our awards. There are 5 that we offer every year: Early Career Scientist, Lifetime Achievement, Public Sector Plant Breeding Impact, Private Sector Plant Breeding Impact. And the Executive Committee of NAPB, when it chooses to do so, can offer an award as a friend of plant breeding. The awardees are acknowledged at the current meeting, and we're going to do that this Thursday evening at the dinner for this cycle. And then they are encouraged, and all of them have accepted so far, presentations at a subsequent meeting. And it just turns out that our 2021 recipient of Private Sector Plant Breeding Impact Award is Mario Carlone, who fits perfectly into this opening session on the history of Iowa's favorite crop. Little background on the award itself. It was established in 2020, Private Sector Plant Breeding Impact Award. It recognizes an individual whose accomplishments as a scientist in the private sector have had extraordinary impact in the field of plant breeding in areas such as germplasm development, cultivar release, technological innovation, and leadership. And I'm going to finish, because Jody's keeping us all in a very tight leash here, with just 2 quotes that I think capture what the letters of support indicated about Mario. Quote, "He knows the agronomic needs of customers and the germplasm patterns which best fit those needs." Another colleague noted that Mario's biggest contribution has been the mentoring role he has played. "I've watched in amazement how Mario has taken young scientists under his wing and then seen them flourish. A significant number of our plant breeding leaders went through the Mario Carlone School of Breeding." So I have the pleasure of introducing the headmaster himself, Dr. Carlone, long-term maize germplasm development.
Okay, can everybody hear me? It's usually not a problem. Is there a pointer on this? Does anyone know? On the top? Okay, thanks. Okay, so long-term germplasm development, that's what I'm going to be talking about. And these are going to be the main areas that I'm going to talk about. Actually, after I found out that I was following Kendall on this meeting, I was going to try to change it up and maybe tell a lot of good graduate student stories about Kendall, but kind of like that saying goes, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, what happens in grad school stays in grad school. So we're going to go over a little bit of the history of and I'll interchange Corteva and Pioneer during this talk. Germplasm, the development of the stiff stalk and non-stiff stalk pools within Corteva. Talk a little bit about some of these sub-heterotic pools and how they've changed over time. Review examples of genetic gain. And then look at some of the backgrounds of some widely grown central corn belt hybrids. And I'll wrap it up a little bit about the technology changes. So as Kendall mentioned, kind of led into a lot of this thing. The beginning and the foundation really belong to those 2 men right there. Henry Wallace and I believe his first hire, Raymond Baker. Those 2 were, I'll call it, the 2 that started the collection of germplasm that allowed the breeding group at Corteva to generate highly productive corn hybrids from back in the double-crossed haze to current. But we had to collect this germplasm, and as Kendall mentioned, back in those days, really, the collection was going out and working with public sector, USDA mostly, but universities, and just collecting different samples of germplasm. Back in them days, there was no lawyers involved, so a lot of it was just, you know, you had a friend, hey, I'll give you this and you give me that, and We went about our ways. And this is the kind of the starting source of germplasm. This is an outline of that germplasm. This was published by Stephen Smith, whatever, I can't see the year, 98. But really it kind of goes over the background of the germplasm. So you can kind of see all the different groupings. You know, you got the reed yellow dense and what makes them up. The Minnesota 13, Lancaster, Northwestern dense, Leeming. This is an internal corn belt female composite. And then, as I showed yesterday, the Maize and Margot were really an interesting story that I'll tell, that very unique. But you can see the scope of which Pioneer's germplasm start is probably the biggest scope probably of any company that at their beginning, and it was because we began such a long time ago. So we call this the universe or the brain at Corteva, and it's really just showing how these heterotic pools started getting pushed apart. And actually, I was just told a couple weeks ago, we're still pushing them apart. And I think we need to keep pushing them apart, because once that pushing apart stops, I think genetic gain will really slow, because then we can only figure out different combinations with them. We're just keep on building upon that. So we had our founders. The red is stiff stalks, the blue is non-stiff stalks, and you can see in the middle some mixing. And then through selection and recombination, we started pushing these apart and building and developing the Pioneer heterotic pattern, which is different than the Iowa State, and et cetera, which is, I think, good in one respect because it adds diversity. Bad in another respect, it makes working between those groups a little more complicated. So I put this is the iodine sub-heterotic pool creation. So I put this together, Jody kind of wanted to know a little bit, but so this outline is an outline of a pedigree put into Hollow and Miranda's book, and it was given by Raymond Baker. I guess the story goes, I guess he got his hand slapped a little bit for telling this secret, which I'm not sure how much you really can make of the secret. But so kind of going and telling a little more about it, this diagram is actually the diagram of off PVP 207. If you guys were at the field day yesterday, I outlined that as the key iodine contributor. That line produced 41 million plus units of seed throughout its career. Top line ever in Pioneer history, and will never be broken for sure. But I think the more interesting part is the piece that Baker did. Iodine was available to everybody. This was an S3, I think Baker or Wallace got from Lindstrom. Everybody could have access to it. And iodines would have gone nowhere except for what Baker did. Baker put together a 40-acre back-crossing project for increasing the ear length of iodines. And without that ear length, and without that 40 acres, which I don't think I could talk a research director and let me do that anymore, but iodines probably would have died, and it probably would not have the influence it today. So, you know, sometimes it just takes a lot of brute force and a lot of determination, because I believe he only selected 3 or 4 ears out of that 40 acres, and that generated the current iodine pool today. So looking at the stiff stalks, and I mentioned this yesterday, you can see in the beginning here, if I get this, we had B73, B14, and B37. But this was during the double cross, and you can see the red is stiff stalks, the blue is non-stiff stalks. During these first generations, breeders didn't know better, and they just intermixed a lot. And that actually added some really uniqueness to the Corteva germplasm base that you would see. Currently, if you're starting a program, you wouldn't do that, or you'd frown, or people would think you were crazy. So then that intermixing occurred, and that occurred because we had the double cross time. because they were just bringing together material that made sense on phenotypic attributes. So you can see the iodines and the reeds went into both sides. Stiff stalks went into the non-stiff stalk side, and vice versa, non-stiff stalks in the stiff stalk side. They built these pools, and then starting to breed them, they started pushing them apart. And so what does that look like in a real line or inbred perspective? Here are three inbreds that trace through same lineage, so they're not different lineage. And you can see this inbred developed in 1983, has 89% BSS in it, mostly B37 followed by B73 followed by B14, and they're a Maize Amargo from B68 and 64. Corteva or Pioneer probably were the only company that really leveraged that. I'm sure other people used it, but from all the data I've seen, I've not seen at least the amount of Maize Amargo. And of course some iodine and Lancaster from that intermixing. But the most interesting part is you can see as we go through time, getting more recent, the amount of pure stiff stock, BSS, within the Corteva stiff stock lines is becoming less, and the increase in what we'll call non-traditional stiff stock is increasing. And this is probably built on that heterotic pattern, finding those genes that come together that give us the type of hybrid we want to sell or the products we want to sell. But again, you can see, you know, even though it was only a small piece of our program, it's been a pretty important piece, this Maize Amargo, because it's been consistently maintained. And that's when you know it's important. I mean, you can bring in diversity and you can throw it out in the next cycle if it doesn't add value. So I also talked a little bit about this. You know, we get into these what we call key sub-heterotic groups, and I'll just explain this a little. The CoA, co-ancestry, and this is on a pedigree basis, and then time across here. So in 1980s, this sub-heterotic pattern was at about 18% of the stiff stalk lines that we used. It rise to about 64% in the early 20s and now has leveled off. And what you can see is when you hit things like this, you get very productive. So in this co-ancestry or this subgroup, you can see hybrids like 3394, 3335, P67, could have put 1197 as the people that were out there in the field that I showed up here in this court. So, but you know, the sub-heterotic pattern, it's kind of like your stock portfolio. It doesn't just always go up. You wish it always went up, but it doesn't always go up. And so here's some examples of north to south movement of subgroups, and then the opposite, south to north group. And most of the time, this is the normal pattern. You move germplasm south to north because more yield south to north. But it's not always the pattern, as you can see here. In 1980, we'll just pick that in the 113 germplasm, this sub-heterotic group had 0%. The 103 germplasm had about 33%. By the year 2010, this group had increased in the 113 to about 30% and has been declining. So this sub-heterotic group has been being leveraged more in the 113 and then decreasing in the 103 where it originally was developed. South to north, as you can see, 103 only had this much in it and then this much. And then by the 2010, the lines have crossed. Now, this germplasm that started off highly used, mostly used in the south, is now being more used in the northern germplasm than in the southern germplasm. And this is an example of a sub-heterotic group really that I wouldn't say goes into extinction, but you can say we've moved out of it where it was highly productive here for a number of years, developed some really very key hybrids in the north. And then about 2000, we found another group that took over its place and developed a shift in the subpool that allowed for the development of P0157. And you can see, once we identified this, how fast it overtook that germ. It basically just said, you're no good anymore. Or, this one was such superior, and this one has gone pseudo into extinction in this maturity. Actually, if you went to an earlier maturity, it's still relevant, but in this maturity, it's pretty much almost extinct. So we kind of looked at, we have these subgroups we call, and a subgroup is just that. You can make up your own subgroup. So these are some subgroups we did, and this is a paper published in Medica, Dave Bubeck and et al. And we just looked at what's the gain within these groups, taking a look at it. And so we just did a little study to see, are they all the same or not? And you can see we do have a variation of genetic gain within these groups. This group, this B73, B37, hasn't, in this study, and it's probably about time for us to run another one, but you can see it's lower. But the one thing you do see is all the groups are gaining. Some at a higher rate and some at a lower rate. Then if you look at the values per cycle for these various traits, a very, interesting number is, if you look at this, the parentals, the inbred that we were doing it on, and then the cycle 1 and the cycle 2 recoveries, almost identical 7 bushel yields for every cycle. If you looked at those numbers, you might even say that they were pseudo made up because they're so good. But that is showing the consistent increase over time, and that's across all those pools, and you can see it. So then we want to look at a key widely used subgroup that isn't so key and widely used within Corteva and Pioneer. And I showed this at the demo. We had Missouri 17 is in the pedigree of the male of 1197. But you can see that the COA is very low. So while if you looked at this for probably a lot of other industry companies, the COA of Missouri 17 is much higher. Although it has been declining, and I think that Mickle had it in some of his work showing Missouri 17 is declining in relevance within the newer patented material. Why? It's, as Kendall said, I think, every company comes up with their own heterotic group, and then they build upon it. And probably, I've always theorized Missouri 17 had its biggest value in the industry by adding flexibility to those hybrids, giving ear flex, and as our densities increased and as our stress tolerance increased, Missouri 17 just had less, its attributes didn't give it as much of an advantage. So looking at some of the backgrounds of the Pioneer corn hybrids that were widely grown in Central Corn Belt, and this was out of a paper from Smith. And so this basically just takes it back and says, how do the lines trace to some of the key land races or key founder groups of germplasm? And you can see that Maize Margot down here came into the Pioneer hybrids in the late 70s, early 80s, and has been consistent. Where other groups, Midland, and I showed this yesterday, Midland was a group that Baker and Murray Browner got drought tolerant and heat tolerant lines out of that Corteva has leveraged. Its influence has been declining. Probably we're keeping the piece that gives us that tolerance, but getting rid of some of the other pieces. And you can see other ones have stayed flat, but really since the 60s, the amount in scope of the land races that we have sorted through has stayed about the same. Some of those pieces have increased, some have decreased, but it hasn't been like we're throwing away a lot of the tracing back through various land races. We're keeping that diversity within the pool of hybrids that we're currently selling. Probably needs to, again, a new update for more recent. So now I wanted to look at kind of how do these groups really shift within the Corteva germplasm. And this is a look at the stiff stalk founder contributors here. And the color is a little go off, but the order is the right order. And I'm not really sure why the color is, but so you can see one of the interesting things is in the 80s, Maize was at a relatively low level in the 98 to 105 maturity hybrids. You look fast forward to 2010, this has increased, and it looks like it's now stabilized at this level across all maturities. Where if you take a look at something like the B, which one was here? Oh yeah, the B, the fourth one over, the B73, you can see that it actually, as Kendall said, it was at a small rate here, but if you go through 2010, we've increased the amount of B73 going north. But it has been a slow and hard road on B73, moving it north. So it's, but you can just see that the shifting patterns through time, the different subgroups don't stay constant, they move, and that movement really is driven off of the heterotic patterns that we're using and the traits and attributes needed beyond yield. And for a lot of times it is yield that drives some of it. B73 has a lot more yield than B14. So now on the non-stiff stalk side, this even becomes a lot more interesting. You can see, if you look at these, you can see the iodines, the female composite. You can see that one of the biggest things that you'll see is, if you go down here at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the Ohio 7s, you can see that they were mainly in these later maturities, but you can see that they've really declined over here where the iodines have really increased across all the maturity groups. And that is just a part of the breeding cycle. Will any of these groups go extinct? Hopefully not, because we know as the environments change and as agriculture changes, you sometimes want to go back to some place that you may not have been in the past. And that kind of leads me to what I call going forward, the new enabling technologies. I guess to me, I call them new. I guess to new grad students, predictive breeding is old school maybe even already, but it's still new. It's being heavily applied and has lots of great attributes, but also has some cautions. It can drive us to a lot of fast short-term gains of getting to where we want to get fast. The question is, do we want to be there for the rest of our life? And if not, how do we make sure we have an out? You know, if you take that driving course, leave yourself an out. Breeding, leave yourself an out also. And with the new other technologies like highly mechanized phenotyping that you can really, I mean, in the old days you made errors, so you kept different germplasm by error. Now where it can be so precise, we can drive that game very fast. We have modeling now that can hopefully predict what the environments change. And then I call this the most interesting new technology, gene editing, where that will go, because that can add a lot of interesting phenotypic variation if allowed to be leveraged to its max. So all these new tools will allow us to move this germplasm or maybe redesign the germplasm even going forward. But they also have all that same attribute of getting us into a hole that we may not want to be in somewhere down the road. So that's always a watch out. So kind of one of my last slide without conclusions is just kind of showing this change over time. For those that haven't seen, this is just the pioneer view, hybrid development over here. You can see field two-plot combines, field mechanization, better plot quality, keys to breeding. I mean, number one key. If you don't have good data, you're not going to get anywhere. But then you can see all this new technology that costs more and hopefully drives gain more too. And then last, I just like some conclusion is, number one, germplasm isn't stagnant. It changes over time. So, 20 years from now, I'm sure those sub-heterotic groups are going to look a lot different in their makeup of what is the most important and what is the least. So it'll change. Genetic pools will continue to evolve over time because of the agronomics, climate change, what's needed. Traits and technologies really have keys to sub-heterotic patterns. There are sub-heterotic patterns out there in the industry that without BT protection would have been extinct, but because they were so weak with corn borer tolerance. So long-term selection in the context of corn demonstrates that genetic gain is still good and well alive. We're still seeing gain going on at pretty much a constant pace, although the cost of that gain is going up. So maybe on a cost basis we're going down. And then new technologies. How do we leverage them to maximize the germplasm, but minimize some of those risks? And then the last one, I think, is in a globally diverse crop such as maize, there is an opportunity to demonstrate breeding for useful and productive genetic diversity that adds the ability to achieve new gain. Maize Amargo is a great, in my mind, a poster child for this. It came out, we've maintained it. So where else is there unique diversity? And then how does it get into a highly productive and market-driven germplasm base? So with that, I'll end it and leave it for some questions if we have a minute or two. Looks like we do.
We have about 6 minutes for questions for Dr. Carlone.
If you have questions, please raise your hand. I'm gonna run to find you.
Thanks for your talk. It was very enlightening. The question I have is related with the last two conclusions, and if you can elaborate a little bit more about the abilities, in this case of the germplasm pool, to adapt to changes in climate and the climate variability. Means the occurrence of, let's say, continuous and multi-year droughts versus the unexpected extreme events that we may see in the future, extreme precipitation, contrasting with the droughts in continuous years, something along those lines or within that environmental context, if you can give us your perspective about it.
So yeah, climate change or changing environments, that's where we need to make sure that those germplasm pools stay diverse enough, yet we need to also, selection gets rid of things, that's selection. And so that's that fine line of moving it forward. I think, if you want to call it the best advantage or the way we can have an advantage maybe with climate change is the good thing is it occurs over time, and that actually plays into breeding, because over time the germplasm can manipulate. What germplasm tends to not be very good at is taking a hard right or a hard left, because it's not used to that. And so our predictive models are based on past data. So that's what we use our past data to predict the future. So if the future is moving differently than the past, they kind of go against each other until you get the new data sets that give you a new predictive way. And so you're always moving a little bit behind. And so that's why we have to have that diversity in there, so that hopefully you have enough there that you can switch it as we move through time and space.
Okay, thanks for your presentation. The GEM project, Germplasm Enhancement of Maize, has been ongoing for a long time. The public-private, have any of those materials made it into your germplasm pools?
What I'll say is that we are evaluating that material, and that material has been integrated into some things. I can't really say where that is in any space and time at this time, but we are evaluating it all. The hardest part about any of those things is, especially on the 100-year breeding program, Corteva has built up a very defined heterotic pattern. And Howie Smith wrote it, we have an internal book on the, kind of like the Iowa State thing going back in records, is that refined heterotic pattern really resists having different things in there, and you have to figure out unique ways of bringing in those unique differences so that you don't disrupt what we call the machine, because that's what pays the bills. And so the machine has to work, but at the same time you try to bring these other things in that over time allow the machine to have a bigger engine.
More question?
So speaking of a 100-year-old machine, then, just a few years ago, you had to bring the Dow pipeline in with Corteva coming together. What did those more or less 4 different heterotic pools look like coming together into 2?
Very different. So they're very different, and that's an ongoing integration process that we're going through. And so some of it will be easier, and some of it won't be, and some of it is easier to some of it's easier maybe in a different country where the pools tend to work a little better together, and others more difficult.
Okay, one last question from Aaron Lorenz.
Thanks, Mario, for your talk. You made the comment that in order for us to keep making gain, you need to keep driving those heterotic pools apart from one another. I was just wondering, within the Corteva germplasm, or I guess the Pioneer germplasm, to what extent has that divergence of those heterotic groups been through selection versus just random drift? I know these studies have been done in the public germplasm, and I'm not sure within the Pioneer germplasm to what extent that is true.
Yeah. I don't know if we actually did any real studies that says what's drift versus selection. I gotta believe a lot of it has been on selection, because our pools are pretty big. We've got a pretty massive breeding. It's not like one breeding program, so it's quite a big program. So I think most of it's been that we just find these testers and we just drive those things apart, and then recombine these testers and drive those pools further and further apart with our testing and our selection methodology. But I'm sure there's some drift. That always comes up, is that due to selection or drift? And it always goes back, well, we're not academic, so it happens, let's move on. So, and I got one last statement, because Kendall was bringing it up. I think I was I was a Dr. Russell student, and I think I was the last one. I was, I think, number 30 on his list of 33. I think there was two others. I think Don Blackburn, who's here giving a talk, I think he was the last Russell student, if I'm not mistaken. So he'd be number 33 there. So.
Well, so Russell did very well with his last two students then, both award winners at the 2022 plant breeding meeting in Ames. So let's thank both of our speakers.